Good afternoon, and welcome to this event on understanding religion and populism. I am Ann Peters, University and Community Outreach Director at the Pulitzer Center, a nonprofit journalism and education organization based in Washington, D.C., supporting more than 170 reporting projects a year from around the globe, and creating curricular resources and organizing educational events, from working at elementary schools through graduate programs, and of course, for the public. Thank you all for joining us, and we are very much appreciative of this partnership with our co-organizer of the event, the Georgetown University Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, a key partner of the Pulitzer Center's Campus Consortium Network. We want to also thank the Luce Foundation for offering their support and their encouragement in bringing together journalists and scholars on the important issues that we'll be delving into today. Our hope is that this is only the beginning of these conversations, and we plan to continue such gatherings and are eager to hear more from you, our audience. We want to tell you a few logistical points, so you know this before we get into our conversation today. We are recording this webinar, and there is closed captioning available. The recording will also be posted online after the event at the Berkeley Center and at the Pulitzer Center. We will also want to let you know that we will have, at the second half of our event today, questions from the audience. So please, as soon as something comes to mind as you hear from our speakers today, add that to the Q&A box. The complex relationship between media, religion, and populism grows ever more complicated and pronounced with the propagation of social media, new forms of religious extremism, and national populism. We want to take this time today to hear from two individuals, both a journalist and a historian, and gain some insights into this for this conversation. I'd like to introduce our two speakers now. Kalpana Jain is a Pulitzer Center grantee and longtime investigative journalist. During her tenure at the Times of India, she has reported on Hindu nationalism, India's ailing public health system, and social justice issues. Her Pulitzer Center supported project Hindu Nationalism, Its Toll and India's Interfaith Resilience, explores the toll of Hindu nationalism on Indian society through the lives of women and millennials in particular. Next, John Fia is a professor of American history and chair of the history department at Messiah University and a scholar of Christian nationalism. John also is an author or editor of several books, including Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump, and Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? A Historical Introduction. He blogs daily at The Way of Improvement Leads Home. Now I'd like for our speakers to present some initial remarks, and then we'll have a facilitated conversation before we open to audience Q&A. Kalpana?
Thank you so much, Anne, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me into this conversation. Just to get us started, I'd like to just place some context to the history of Hindu nationalism, and then talk a bit about my work, where I was really looking at the women's wing of Hindu nationalism, the Durga Vahini, and how that's playing a role at this point of time. So just to recap briefly, the history of Hindu nationalism, this emerged as a political ideology in India under the British colonial rule in the early 20th century. And, for those who may not be aware, Hinduism really, was never like one unitary religion. This was a Western framing of the religion. Hinduism involves multiple beliefs, multiple castes, multiple ways of being. So it was Veer Savarkar, he was a former anti-colonial revolutionary who translated this idea of Hindu unity, and he made it a more potent symbol, that of the Indian state. And he first published in 1923 his text on Hindutva. Hindutva is another word for Hindu-ness. And the text was, Who is a Hindu? And he saw religious boundaries as national ones, and he considered Islamic and Christian traditions as an illegitimate foreign presence. But the person who really, moved that forward was an upper caste Brahmin, Keshav Hejawar, who founded what would become a preeminent Hindu nationalist association, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or RSS. So, India was founded, as many of you might know, it was founded as a secular nation that's enshrined in the constitution. So for a long time, the RSS wasn't really politically active as such, but it had a large grassroots base. Those are known as shakhas, and people voluntarily joined the shakhas. It was about being immersed in a Hindu culture. Part of it was about, also countering the Western notion of what was said to be, at least what has been written about, as an emasculate Indian male, and they wanted to show, this strong Indian male, and so they trained in martial arts, etc. And until the mid 1970s, actually, the number of these shakhas was relatively low. And it's interesting to see, what it politically pushes up these numbers. And that time, India went through an emergency, and the number of shakhas, which was, close to 9,000 then. And if we come to today, according to the annual report of the RSS, that's about 90,000. So that's a lot of increase. And if we take around 50 to 100 people, per shakha, that's quite a few people. And, these days, apparently, college students comprise 62% of RSS members. And in addition, there are several other affiliated organizations. There are student-led organizations. And the one that I really focused on is Durga Vahini. That is a women's organization. And it's very interesting to meet and talk to those women who are very simple, ordinary women, housewives, most of them, have grown under very strong patriarchal roots, as a number of them said to me, that they were never allowed to fulfill their dreams, and they never thought that they'll ever get to be out in the public and what they see as their identity and a voice and being someone other than being someone's wife or daughter. So it gave them a sense of empowerment. Now, Durga Vahini, I met the trainers for young girls. It trains young girls into learning, again, what they say about Hindu culture. But when you look closely, it's a little more than that, because in that training of Hindu culture, there is misrepresentation of history, there's misrepresentation of facts. There's also this otherness created of the outsider, the Muslim. Through the Durga Vahini is also, they talk about what's known in India as, or not in India, the RSS is love jihad, which means that Muslims are enticing Hindu girls as a way of converting them to Islam. So the fact is that these women are taking that up. They are, conveying that to families, to young girls. And the truth is that today, at least one state, the most populous state in India, has come up with a law on that couples who have these intercaste, interreligion marriages have to go and register with a district magistrate who's who has legal powers, and then to take permission whether they can get married or not, which to me is disturbing. But these are also symbolisms, and BJP is using these kind of symbolisms. I also want to add quickly that until the 1980s, BJP, which is the pro-Hindu nationalist, political wing of RSS, had like 2 MPs, 2 seats in the party, and it was from 1990 where they launched a major movement around a religious site called the Ram Janmabhoomi, that their support started to grow, and this was as a way to counter or gather Hindu unity around what was coming up as affirmative action. This was, a Mandal commission. A commission had come up with caste-based reservations for lower caste. And that was sort of the BJP's response to build Hindu unity around it. And I'll just add one more historical detail before I pause, is that traditionally, I mean, not traditionally, historically, Hindu nationalists have done that. You know, what you see today in news about Muslims have been lynched for eating cow or allegations of eating beef. That was a movement that emerged back in the late 19th century, again as a part of Hindu unity to protect cows, and that slaughter of cows could become an effective symbol to bring about such unity. And it was so popular that Hindus across caste differences were participating in that meeting. And what I'm saying is that symbolism is being used again in multiple ways, and Durga Vahini is pushing that. And I'll pause here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalpana. John?
Yes, thank you for having me. And I am a scholar of American history. I'm a historian. I approach this particularly in the American context, these questions of Christian nationalism, religion, and populism. I just want to start with a little story and then sort of develop a few things that I think the story teaches us about this whole Christian nationalist populist movement in the United States. And it's the story of a young man named Taylor Etheridge. Taylor was days away from starting a new job as a youth pastor at an evangelical church in Florida. He was a high school football star and married, had a young child. But a few weeks before he moved to Florida to start his new job as a youth pastor, he decided to take a trip to Washington, D.C. On January 17, 2021, he tweeted a video of himself inside the U.S. Capitol. The video, as you might imagine, was recorded on January 6, 2021. And I just want to quickly read a part of what he said in that video. Tyler Etheridge said, "I don't want to say what we're doing is right." Again, as the riots are going on in the Capitol. "I don't want to say what we're doing is right, but if the election is being stolen, what is it going to take, really? Is it going to take people just talking about it? I'm probably going to lose my job as a pastor after this, but what is it going to take? I don't see anyone out here that are just teachers. Talk is cheap, and I think we're to the point where talk is cheap. If this makes me lose my reputation, I don't care. I don't care about my reputation. I care about my nation. I care about it for my daughter and my child. That is what I care about. It's more than just talking, it's doing. There comes a point where you have to do." Again, this is a young man who is about to start a position as a youth pastor at a large Florida church. I looked into Etheridge a little bit. After high school, he played football at a state university in Texas. He battled bouts of depression, some substance abuse that brought an end to his political career, but he eventually got his life back together. He moved to Colorado, and he enrolled at a school called Charis Bible College. That's Charis, Charis Bible College in Woodland Park. It was a school founded by a charismatic preacher, a diehard Trump supporter named Andrew Womack. And while he was there, he took courses in what had previously been called the David Barton School of Government. From my research, I found that the school is no longer named after David Barton, but Barton and his son, Tim, still teach at the school. And most of David Barton's writings about Christian nationalism and the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation are part of the curriculum. Etheridge graduated from Charis Bible College, loved to praise his professors on his Twitter feed. He took classes again with both the Bartons. He claimed to have taken classes with a man named Lance Wallnau, who is a prophet from the charismatic circles. He became famous in charismatic circles when he prophesied a Donald Trump victory in 2016. He took a course from William G. Boykin, who is a retired U.S. Army general. I think he was a 3-star general, who now serves as the vice president of the Family Research Council. And while at Caris, Ethridge had a variety of different options for courses, but some of those courses included titles such as, quote, The Seven Mountains of Influence, The Miracle of America, The Christian Heritage of American Government, Faith of Our Founders, The Role of Pastors in Government, How to Run for Office, I love that one, Creationism and the Flood, Biblical Free Enterprise, and The Principles of War. Throughout much of the summer of 2020, Ethridge tweeted and retweeted historical information that he said proved America was founded as a Christian nation. He talked about saving America, getting America to wake up from their slumber, that he stood with Jesus Christ and America and was willing to stand with Jesus Christ and America, even if it cost him his life and his livelihood. He even talked about meeting Ted Cruz at Caris Bible College while he was a student. Needless to say, when he tweeted this on when he gave his initial tweet from the Capitol on January 17th, he was prophetic because the Florida church fired him the next day, even before he arrived on the job. So what is the story of Tyler Ethridge tell us? I think Tyler Ethridge's story shows the connection between this notion of Christian nationalism, the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation and needs to be reclaimed or renewed or restored as a Christian nation. I think this idea also connects it, Ethridge's story also connects this idea to a kind of populism, which is often defined by anti-intellectualism, by a distrust of elites, right? Secular elites, secular humanists who are trying to teach an alternative vision of America that does not connect to, the Christian founding that many of these people believe in. I think the fact that he is there to try to overturn the election, in the Capitol at least, to try to overturn the election, shows populism's appeal, at least in the United States, to certain kind of strong men. I think it shows the connection between of populism with sort of ordinary people that are being don't have a voice, right? They need a voice in society to rise up and defend what they believe to be, in this case, a Christian nation. So these are the kinds of issues that I study. I trace these kinds of things historically, for the most part. And what I've kind of argued, and I'm happy to talk more about it during Q&A, is that what we saw with the kind of Christian nationalism at the US Capitol, or even the Christian nationalism that really supported Donald Trump through his presidency, at his election and his presidency, is really something that has been a characteristic of American evangelicalism for a long time, dating all the way back to the birth of the Republic and even before. So again, hopefully we can talk a little bit more about this if you have questions and so forth. But I use the story of Ethridge here because it connects so many dots for me. And it clearly shows, I think, the presence between this kind of anti-intellectual populism that's being promoted at a lot of these Christian nationalist schools and institutes, and by these writers, and by what I call a kind of evangelical populist infrastructure, David Barton, so forth, and what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, and really the Trump presidency as a whole. Thanks.
Thank you both. And thank you for these initial remarks. I just want to remind our audience that please begin to add any questions that you have that came out of those initial remarks, or as we continue a little bit longer with some initial conversation among the panelists. A couple of points in terms of, I think at one point, John, you've also written about this fear of social and demographic change, and Kalpana, this may also come in the context of India. Can you both spell out perhaps a little bit more of that in terms of how that maybe drives some of, in particular, John, with Christian nationalism here in the US? And then Kalpana, if you see connection?
Yeah, again, speaking just specifically here to the United States context, I think at every moment in United States history, whenever there has been some kind of social or or demographic change, largely this is associated with immigration, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be associated with intellectual shifts in the culture and so forth. You always see a backlash, right? Whether it be the backlash against Irish immigrants coming into the country in the 1850s, whether it be Muslims, right? Today, the fear, the travel bans and the fear of Sharia law, and all of these kinds of things. You see this over and over again. You see it in the late 19th and early 20th century with sort of intellectual shifts, particularly related to the rise of science, evolution, and kind of critiques, higher criticism of the Bible, right? These kinds of things. There's always a backlash. And oftentimes, almost all the time, that backlash is usually led by Christian evangelical Christians who are somewhat concerned about what these social and economic changes are doing to their Christian nation that they believe that they are the guardians of, right? These are threats. These are immediate threats, right, to the Christian nation. I think you saw this profoundly in the late 1970s and 80s as the Christian right began to respond to the cultural changes of the 1960s and 70s, particularly the removal of prayer and Bible reading from public schools, the Hart-Celler Act or the Immigration Act of 1965, which greatly diversified the country in terms of immigration. I think you see it in response to the fear of abortion and Roe v. Wade. I think you also see it. Race is involved here. I think the historian Randall Balmer has pointed this out. You see a fear of big government coming into, especially in the South, and desegregating academies, right? How dare these big government people come in and tell us how to live, right? Tell us that we can't, we'll lose funding if we continue these kinds of racist, Jim Crow, segregationist policies. There's a great fear of all of this. So I think fear is always a response. This backlash is always characterized by fear. It's always characterized by nostalgia. In the United States, let's get back to this time when these threats were not there, right? Make America great again, or something to that effect. And then especially since the 1970s, I think these social and cultural changes, this attempt to win back the culture from these changes and make us a more Christian nation, are often associated with the pursuit of political power, whether it be the presidency or the Congress or the Supreme Court, to control the levers of power so that this kind of Christian nationalism Christian nation can be reclaimed, renewed, restored. So over and over again, you see this. So I think in some ways, Donald Trump is very unique in that so many evangelicals turn to this kind of playboy reality television star. But in some ways, I think there's continuity there throughout American history. In some ways, Trump, with social media and so forth, his Twitter use, and Trump kind of lifted the veil and kind of really exposed this kind of dark side of American evangelicalism, sort of for all to see. In a way, it sort of really hadn't been there anymore. And it sort of freed up many evangelicals to kind of move beyond the kind of decorum and civility that they have been they've been complaining about this for years, but they've done it in a kind of civil kind of way. But now there suddenly were outlets for them to express their rage, if you will, that weren't there before. And I think Trump clearly tapped into that outrage.
Yeah, so going into India, I think the story there is a little different because Modi did not come on this plank of Hindu nationalism. At the time when he was elected in 2014, it was more about, people knew who Modi was, but he still tried to distance himself from that image. And he promised jobs. And, as you know, that India is, it's a young country with about 600 million people who are young. And jobs are needed. He promised development. We'd, been through, a rule of Congress party for 10 years. There'd been a lot of corruption. So this was an anti-incumbency vote. he seemed like he definitely, portrayed himself as a strong man, a powerful leader. There's a famous quote from that time where he's talking about his 36-inch chest. So, a lot of that chest thumping, showing masculine energy, and, I'm a leader in command and in control. So that's the way he came in. After that is, how the politics happened. And, in India, bringing about Hindu unity is not a small thing. So to tell Hindus you're all one is not something that fits in with people, or a lot of people culturally. Hinduism is so many things. And as I said earlier, it was, again, so many things keep going back to colonialism. When the British came, they gave categories. So the Hinduism emerged for people who basically lived on the other side of the river Indus, and were therefore Hindus in the Persian translation. And here so there were the people who worshipped Shiva and were Shaivites, or worshipped Vishnu and were Vishnuites, and there were Jains, Buddhists. Now there they all get clubbed into one Hindu category, and people still don't believe that. So as I said earlier, that then comes these symbolisms. In 2015 was the first attack, and I'll say lynching, that happened on a Muslim man. It was widely covered by media, as it would be, but I would argue that it actually benefited Modi, because they wanted this word to spread. And then there were further lynchings. Now we don't hear as much of those lynchings, but at that time there were just so many of these lynchings. So cow became a symbol, as it did in the late 19th century, of bringing a certain Hindu unity together around a sacred animal. And I mean, that also is interesting. When does cow become sacred? But now it's treated as sacred. And as has been seen earlier, why was the cow, even chosen to be that sacred animal? Because, it evokes the piety, mother, cow would be known as mother. It gives food, it gives milk, it's nourishing. So it brings together a very strong symbolic thing. So that is what they did around at that time, 2015, and it spread. I see a question there about, whether of its regional character, but it spread. And that's the way it spread to pretty much all of the country. And it's interesting, the use of, because these days, India, everyone has pretty much some kind of, smartphone, whether expensive or cheap. WhatsApp is on all phones. So the news was used through WhatsApp. Mobs were, sort of mobilized through WhatsApp messages. It's completely insane how this whole thing was driven. And then Modi comes back. And by the way, I mean, when I went on and talked to people, it wasn't just Hindus that were supporting him initially, it was Muslims as well. He was doing things for development. At least that's what the Muslim, areas were saying. But he's done this, he brought us water. The Muslim women were saying, he ended, in India, there was this thing of that a Muslim man could say, I divorce you 3 times to a Muslim woman, and they could be divorced without anything. People were divorcing Muslim women on Facebook, through WhatsApp. So it had become so bizarre. So Supreme Court ends that. So Muslim women see that as having, benefited something, under Modi, which wasn't done earlier. It was a very controversial thing. So Modi is doing all these things. And at the same time, he's building this whole base of BJP, the pro-Hindu Nationalist Party. And then other things start to emerge, exactly what John has mentioned, this thing about this is carried on, we are morally superior, othering of other minorities. Then, again, use of Twitter. It's very interesting, the similarities between Donald Trump and Modi. Modi, until 2019, had not held a single news conference. He only communicated through Twitter. And at this point of time, it's like media, he targets media simply for doing reporting. He makes examples out of people. So he'll pick up, I'm not saying he, so, excuse me there, but the government will pick up one journalist who's done some reporting, put him in jail, use sedition laws, like a sedition law was used against a 22-year-old activist. Now, when did that ever happen? But yes, all these laws existed, and even past governments used them. But this government has used them in a completely different way, to silence dissent, to silence any kind of criticism. So in a second comeback, it has gone to another level. And plus, so I mentioned the Hindu unity of using cow as a symbol. Then how they're also emerging and taking, converting certain sites into their religious symbols. Now, Rama isn't the Hindu god for everyone. People worship Krishna, people worship Shiva, people could worship Durga. I mean, there's various devotees, and there are various ways of being a Hindu. Even being an atheist is a way of being a Hindu. But under Modi, there's this, which was started again earlier, but this place, this city called Ayodhya, and I've been there, which is treated as the birthplace of Lord Rama, becomes like the new religious center. When I went there, they were about to construct this, huge statue, maybe 20 feet more, of Lord Rama, convert it into this religious center. And there's a whole different kind of revival of religion taking place. I was there at a time when there was a big religious gathering going on. And, from something that was a few thousand of people who would go on that annual pilgrimage, now there were millions supported by the state. Now, and these are young people, and many of them don't have jobs. So it's like how he's exploiting anything and everything in that society. Again, coming back to Durga Vahini. So, in the discussion this morning, there was talk about who started this. Durga Vahini was this very firebrand woman who didn't hesitate from violence, who would give these speeches, very hateful speeches. But over the years, it's been translated into an organization that is blending the boundaries of caste and class. So when I met these women, they were not upper class. Some of them were upper caste, but then they are trying to include the, sort of Hindu unity, Hindu society, Hindu woman, and that the Muslim is a threat for all of us. So launch this, whole propaganda against love jihad. We want Hindu girls to marry only Hindu men. And therefore this law that has come in to ban marriage between or intermarriage with other religions. I'll stop here and I'll see what the questions are.
Okay, yeah, we do have quite a lot of questions coming up, so perhaps we can turn to some of those. And just in terms of the thanks also from our audience for sharing your thoughts. One of our audience members is asking whether both of you could talk about perhaps how more progressive or more faith-based groups respond to or can respond to religious nationalism and its impacts. It's an open-ended question in terms of trying to counter what you all have been speaking to.
So can I say something on that? India is a very complicated picture again, and I'm sure every place is complicated. So yes, there are people who will support Modi for different reasons, and part of that being that he's launching all this campaign, he's putting the Hindu culture out, we are morally superior, we are proud of our culture, the politics of nostalgia, as John and others have mentioned. But at the same time, there is so much diversity, and we have a tradition of living together for centuries and centuries. So it's not just faith leaders. So Muslims, let's say a city like Varanasi, which is Modi's parliamentary constituency. So it's important. But the Muslims in that area are the ones who produce the saris for the gods in the temples, the flowers, they grow the flowers, they do everything, the businesses are linked. As far as faith leaders are concerned, so, there are the faith leaders on Modi's side who are activist faith leaders. But I met this group of what are called Kabir Panthis. So Kabir was a poet, think back, I'm forgetting, 14th century. And he wrote these couplets. He was, born in maybe in a Hindu household, adopted by Muslim parents. Today you go to the museum has a mosque and a temple, both built together. So he at that point of time also he advocated Hindu and Muslim amity. And today when you go there, the young people there, Kabir is sort of their god. So this is one side of the millennials, that people are then turning to figures like him to find some relief from what is going on under this regime. So there are just so many currents going on. But what is the dominant current is because Modi is sort of the political ruler.
I think in terms of the progressive ideas that are out there in the religious community, I think a lot of Christian nationalists, almost all of them, are conservative evangelical Christians. They will not hear anything that a non-Christian progressive has to say. They would not listen to even mainline Protestants who are progressive, who are pushing against this Christian national narrative, largely because they're not true Christians, as they would understand them, right? They're not saved. They are naturally going to side with the kind of secular forces that are undermining Christian America, because they don't believe that God is, at least they think they don't believe that God is providential and that this nation, he's superimposing his will for this nation. If there's any kind of hope, and I'm even skeptical about this, it would be the best people to have a chance to do this would be within the progressive wing of the evangelical community. People like Jim Wallace from Sojourners, or Ronald Sider, or the Red Letter Christians, as they're known as, Shane Claiborne. Some of the listeners may be familiar with these names. But even that, these evangelicals who speak the same language as the conservative evangelicals, these progressive evangelicals who, maybe even attend the same churches in some cases, or can pray the same way, right? Even they are held at arm's length by the conservative Christian nationalist wing of evangelicalism, because they do not. They have a view of what Christians call the kingdom of God that, is prophetic in nature, that speaks against the kind of idolatry of nationalism, as they would say. It shouldn't surprise us that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and the same number did roughly in 2020. There's historical reasons for this. I always say this when, I'm an American historian, and in my U.S. history textbook, there are maybe a paragraph next to the last chapter, or the last chapter, about the rise of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, and all of these things. There should be a whole chapter on Falwell. He's probably the most influential political figure since World War II, because he taught millions and millions and millions of white evangelical Christians that there's only one way of doing politics, and that politics is deeply embedded with the reclamation of America as a Christian nation. There have been evangelicals who are not embracing Falwell's vision, who have been articulating evangelical visions of political engagement for years. They've been doing this, but they have not gotten any traction because of the influence of the Christian right on ordinary evangelicals in the pew. So, I think progressive evangelicals maybe have a better chance at kind of debunking this, but as long as progressive evangelicals are going to remain committed to sort of also Enlightenment values of modern values of evidence-based arguments, and not making an appeal to public policy based upon immediate revelation from God, or as long as they believe in science, or as long as they believe in, truth, historical evidence and so forth, they're not going to get much traction at all either. So, I think progressive evangelicals right now are sort of tilting at windmills in some way. And I think they will continue to tilt. They've been tilting at these windmills since the 70s, right? But how much traction they're going to get, I just don't know. I mean, I actually told my class this the other day. We were talking about, historians who write books, or cultural critics or pundits who write books to try to change the world. And then, 15 years later, they just realized that they failed, right? They weren't able to do it, right? So, yeah, that's how I would respond to this idea of the kind of possibility of a progressive voice speaking anyway, crossing over to like make sense to a Christian nationalist. There's just too much anti-intellectualism going on there. Yeah.
Can you, just following up on that, in terms of Christian nationalism, and one of our audience members is speaking to the issue of race in terms of Christian nationalism, predominantly white, but much weaker among Black and Hispanic Protestants and Catholics. Can you talk about why that might be the case, and also whether along other, lines of identity, whether it's gender and so forth?
I think Christian nationalism is ultimately a historical project, although most Christian nationalists won't put it this way, right? It's a story. It's a project about going back. It's a project about making America great again. It's a project, back what I said originally, it's a project about trying to return to an era when, some golden age that probably never existed in the first place, right? Or if it did exist, is never coming back, right? A return to a golden age when America was much simpler. Now, again, usually then it's returning to a golden age that in which you see, white men and women at the center of the culture. The slaves are set free in the South, right? And how do Southern evangelicals respond, right? Their culture is disrupted. It's become, it's now become disorderly is the word they would use, right? So we need to kind of create some kind of political understanding to show that this was bad, right? Or that these newly freed men and women are no longer kind of or should not be, I should say, part of the culture that we have created here in the South, right? That's just one small example. So, I mean, most of my African American friends that I talk to about this would say, despite what we saw this past summer, despite the the race riots and so forth in the wake of the George Floyd killing, a lot of my African American friends would also say, and I hope this isn't taken as being too controversial, but they would say today is still the best time in American history, perhaps, to be an African American. Simply because no African American, at least my friends that I told, want to go back. Right? No one wants to go back to the 50s or to the 19th century or to some kind of a golden age. Now, again, it goes in cycles, right? Maybe this is a particularly bad time right now, and it certainly is. But I think most white Christian nationalism tends to be white because there's this yearning, although they don't put it in this language, there's this yearning for a white America. And immigration as well, whether it be people of Hispanics or Middle Eastern immigrants and so forth. A lot changed after the Hart-Celler Act in 1965. America became incredibly more diverse, and most white native Christians, as they would, nativism would be the word that would, to describe their political sensibilities, are fearful of these changes. They've always been fearful of these changes, and it's always tied to race.
Shall I comment on the question? So I know related to this, someone's asking about lower caste Dalits and tribals. How do they respond to Hindu nationalism? I will also add women to this, given my work has been with women. And I will say this, that historically, Hindu nationalists have been led by upper caste. and upper class. The founder of the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, was a Brahmin. If you look now, even in my work with Durga Vahini, the women's wing of Hindu nationalists, they are not controlling the narrative. They are getting their directions from the very patriarchal, all male, upper class organizations. And it's a very, very patriarchal network, and with its upper caste sensibilities. And just to illustrate with an example of what, I'm a journalist, so I respond to news. And what very recently happened in news in one of the universities, which is also an example of how this government is trying to dictate to universities. In one of the universities, a PhD paper talked about the BJP being an upper caste party, which has riled the politicians, the ruling party, so much that they asked the director of the institution that how did that student get his PhD? Because he used just those words. And that's been an ongoing controversy there. But that is a fact. Is Rama the god for the lower caste, the tribals? I will say no. I mean, there are so many gods. And Rama has, traditionally been, one in the north. And it's one Hindu god. There are, tribal gods, tribal worship, lower caste. It's a variety of worship and very different from what now is being projected. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. There are a number of, just going back a little bit more, John, in terms of perhaps bringing people together at a same level from a historical point of view, a number of questions from the audience, just thinking in terms of this idea of the founding of the United States, in terms of some of the ideology and commentary from that time to now. Just straight away, one particular audience member just said, considering you as a historian, what is your conclusion in terms of, did America start as a Christian nation? Or where are we coming from? Like, at what point?
Well, I think, I said this in the response to the last question, I'm obviously biased, but I think American historians have an important role to play in this discussion. I think much of what you saw, in the most recent manifestation of Christian nationalism at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th was rooted in a specific understanding of what the American project was, what the American Revolution was. If you believe that the United States founders tried to create a distinctly Christian nation that privileged Christianity to some degree over, again, it gets complicated because most Christian nationalists would also accept the disestablishment clause, right? But they would say disestablishment means, like the founders said, we aren't going to have a Presbyterian or a Methodist or a Baptist establishment, right? But it's certainly a Christian, generic Christian one, right? But if you believe that the founding was a Christian event, then you are going to fight like hell, literally in some cases, right, to try to restore it, right? Because the whoever it was, the liberals, the left, the secularists, whatever, are hijacking your nation. And so I think, I wrote a book in 2011, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation, where I sort of tackled this in a kind of, I tried to be as apolitical as possible. I tried to not take a side or, just lay out the facts, right? What was the relationship between religion and the American founding? I think it's a complicated question from a purely historical point of view, but most people who are using the idea of America as a Christian nation today and arguing that don't really care about complexity and nuance, right? They want to cherry pick whatever they can from the past and use that to promote their political agendas in the present. They want to take a 1980s Ronald Reagan era, Christian right era culture war question. Are we or aren't we a Christian nation? Were we or were we not founded as a Christian nation? And superimpose that question upon 18th century founding fathers that did not see this as a major issue. I could spend a lot of time answering this question, but I think if you look at the 18th century and the founding itself, I think on one hand, I think you have certain people on the left who want to describe the founding as a completely secular event in which the founders didn't believe religion was important to sustaining a republic, that they were all deists or, atheists of some type. I don't think that reflects the historical record, but neither were the founders, evangelical Christians who wanted to create a distinctly Christian nation. Now, I think you could find people who, for example, founders who want not the writers of the Constitution, but founders of state constitutions who have test oaths, right? You have to believe in in Pennsylvania, my state where I live now, you had to believe in the inspiration of the Old and New Testaments in order to be able to vote or hold office. That sounds like a Christian nation to me, right? Or Judeo-Christian nation, right? Or you had these established churches where tax money in Massachusetts went to the paying of the Congregationalists, whether you were a Congregationalist or not. That to me is a Christian society. But I think after the passing of the 14th Amendment, after the Civil War, as I understand the 14th Amendment was designed to force the states, especially on the issue of slavery, but to force the states to conform to the United States Constitution, which does not have a test oath for office, right? Which has a disestablishment of religion. So after the 14th Amendment, and especially after the 14th Amendment in the early 20th century was applied to test oaths and religion and the separation of church and state, you can no longer claim that America is a Christian nation today. Now, of course, most Christian nationalists would say some of those cases, especially one in 1947, Board versus New Jersey, Everson versus Board of New Jersey, were wrongly decided, right? So, or that the word separation of church and state was used as a kind of, it's Thomas Jefferson's words, and it wasn't what they said at the founding. There's all kinds of debates about this, but ultimately, the historical question about the founding is a complicated and complex one that reflects the realities of the 18th century world that the founders were writing in, the Western kind of Christian culture in which the founders were writing in. I think what is amazing about the founders is they did separate church and state. They did disestablish. They did say there was no religious test for office, which was somewhat countercultural to the sort of, rank and file people living in the colonies at the time.
And do you see, in terms of looking back and looking now at contemporary, for lack of a better word, movements in this area, is there a distinguishing factor that you see now in the current situation? We talk about social media and the rise of the use of social media. What do you see one of our audience members trying to have you make that comparison, even in the last 4 years?
Yeah, I think there's, again, continuity and change, right? That's what historians do. I think there's a lot that's been there before. I said Trump was a kind of unveiling, but I think you also have to say that what we're seeing in the so-called age of Trump is something very unique. The opportunity, I think social media is huge here. We're beginning to see what many of these Christian nationalists who, are actually now really thinking and really believing, right, about this, whether it be, the convergence with with certain sectors of evangelicalism and QAnon conspiracies, or, I mean, the House of Representatives had to shut down yesterday because people thought on March 4th they were gonna, Trump was gonna be put back in office. There are a lot of people, pastors are telling me and others that there are people in their churches who, believe these kinds of things. So we are in a kind of unique moment where these kinds of conspiracy theories and Christian nationalist ideas that have been around for a long time are now getting a much more of a mainstream voice than they had been in the past. If you asked me about kind of Seven Mountains dominionism or theocracy or these reconstructionist attempts to take, if you asked me that 10 years ago, I said, they're just fringe. I don't pay much attention to those. This is not really evangelicalism. But I think they really have become mainstream, and the groups that follow these, like the People for the American Way, the Right Wing Watch, and so forth, which were kind of, I used to thought, well, they're just following these fringe groups. They're now following, in some ways, a significant portion of American evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, and in a somewhat different way, it's the same thing that's happening in India. It's like how technology is being used, whether it's, as I mentioned before, WhatsApp or the use of Twitter to spread these messages. And, the comments on those messages show, just as John said, what people are thinking and, where they're taking these ideas and the hate speech out there that can actually exist in a public domain today. And a little differently, as we've discussed, that the Indian movement really started as a movement of nation building. And at that point of time, they used schools, the school masters who were leaders in that society, to pass that message around. And today it's so different. It's like the leaders of those movement, or what was a movement back then, has completely changed. And it's in the hands of really extremist groups who've been completely indoctrinated. So it's devolved into a very different thing from, at least in the Indian context, from where it started.
And I think people see, because of social media, people suddenly know, hey, I believe this my whole life, but now I find that Joe down the road believes it too, right?
Yes.
And they can create these kinds of communities. Say, well, I'm not alone in these views that I have, and this leads to political mobilization around, in America at least, around these kinds of anti-intellectual views of science or history or the founding or whatever. Yeah.
No, that's very true. And in India, it's I'll say it's anti-elite and it's anti-Western. So anything that's associated with Western, whether it's kind of your dressing, your attire, or even girls dating. So anything, it's like, okay, so that's an erosion of the Indian culture. Mm-hmm. And it just gains salience as gets more and more on social media and WhatsApp.
Yeah.
What's fascinating too, and you say that, what's fascinating about the American Christian nationalists is just, how Christian really are they, right? They're not resist, they look, you could be sitting next to a Christian nationalist at a movie, well, if we ever have movies again, right? But in a movie theater, and you don't even know it because they look exactly like you, right? There is no kind of materialistic or physical kind of manifestation about what you wear or what they do everything else the culture does, which certainly reflects, evangelical accommodation with the culture throughout much of American history. There is no deeply theological or religious, critique of the culture because, of course, the culture is Christian or, yeah.
Yeah, but when it comes to culture, it's like, who's deciding that culture for you, and who decides, what is Hindu culture? And if they decide what's Hindu culture, then maybe also decide what's Hindu ethics, but they're not going in there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, one question, we were talking about media, and I know we're getting down to the end, and we've had, I think, almost 36 questions. So we will be saving these questions and perhaps trying to answer them separately as we have the recording going online and so forth. But in terms of the role of the media, and this is kind of taking off one of our audience questions, which was, how has the media and exchange of ideas impacted populism, nationalism over the years in the context of religion? But also, what I would flip it somewhat and say, what role can media journalists play in this to raise up inaccuracies, raise up and change the way things may be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a journalist, so you can imagine that I will definitely say, but there is also a reason you're putting other views, putting information, you're putting facts out there. Like what's happening under Modi is a complete crushing of any kind of voice in the media, of dissent in the media. I've been sitting in newsrooms with editors, and it's very hard anymore to report truth, to report the facts. And those facts are so important because otherwise what's happening is that rumors are taking over. People are getting the information, but from some very different sources that have not been vetted. And that's why the media is so important. We are journalists for a reason. You vet everything, you attribute everything, you provide source information. So therefore, the name of the medium, you are the medium to that. And there is a purpose and a role and a training that goes into very carefully putting each word out and doing it in a balanced way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think the silos that exist are now in the United States, are just, none of these Christian nationalists or these populists trust, some of them don't even trust Fox News anymore. It's One America, it's Breitbart, it's Newsmax, it's whatever, the Epic Times, which I just learned about, so how do you, I think journalists need to, good journalists need to keep doing what they're doing, of course. But sometimes I wonder whether the good journalists are going to make any kind of, and forgive me for stepping on toes here, but if they're going to make any kind of real change in the immediate, in our current moment. But their need is, and this is the historian in me speaking, right? They need to keep doing this work because we need a record of what happened. Right? So when we look back, we say, oh my gosh, this is, at least someone was telling the truth. So in some ways the work they're doing has a historical value to it, right? That maybe most journalists don't really think about when they're writing a story about a contemporary moment. Because I know me as someone who's writing now about, evangelicals in the Obama and Trump years, I'm going back to, journalists, I'm writing that sort of, if journalism is the first draft, right? I'm now starting to write the second draft, right? And I need the journalists to get this straight.
Very true, John. And I don't want to be bleak about the change because we did see how the Me Too movement emerged. It's,
Sure.
Change is happening. You just have to keep going on, and journalists have to know that the change will happen. It is happening, and their writing or their words or their reporting matters.
Yeah. Well,
No argument here.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. As I said, we've had so many questions that we couldn't get to, and we really appreciate our audience today. We're aiming to save those and share those with our panelists. So hopefully we may be able to get some of these answered in the short report that we'll have with the recording. So at this time, I just want to thank our audience members for joining us at this event today on understanding religion and populism. I know in a lot of ways, we've only scratched the surface, so we do envision more conversations. We're thankful for our two panelists, Kalpana Jain and John Fia. And of course, the Pulitzer Center is very grateful for our co-organizer of this gathering with the Georgetown University Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And so with that, I will sign off and thank all of you today for being with us. Have a good afternoon.